Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Northern California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. After these past 18 months of conversations and research, a process of seeking to understand the questions and truths so vehemently rejected by social and scientific authorities, I've come to understand that so much of what we're told about the nature of reality, the human mind, and the universe more broadly just isn't true. Mystery is alive and well. Our existence on this planet, its purpose, scope, and breadth are hardly settled matters. And by convincing ourselves that the mysteries are solved, that the complete truth is only a few more scientific discoveries away, we've robbed ourselves of purpose and strangled the natural curiosity that makes us who we are as a species. We need to flip the script and finally accept the evidence that's long been staring us in the face. We need to proceed with humility and understanding that there is much we still don't know about the nature of life and existence, and that to preclude certain kinds of questions based on dogma and a materialistic, mechanistic prejudice serves no one. Our guest today, psychologist and consciousness researcher Dr. Dean Radin, has done more to prove these conclusions than almost any other man in science. Using the tools of science with rigor and determination, Radin, over many years, along with his colleagues, has demonstrated that the human mind has sometimes subtle, sometimes wondrous capabilities to grok information about the world that is closed to our senses, but somehow available to our conscious minds. Clairvoyance, precognition, telepathy, telekinesis, these are the kinds of mystifying abilities Radin and others have repeatedly demonstrated to be true in the laboratory according to the rules of science. And still, many mainstream scientists and academics continue to froth at the mouth when this subject comes up, and immediately point to fraud or ineptitude to explain results they won't accept. That such results occur makes them question the foundations of their field and research rather than amend an increasingly fragile scientific worldview. The statistical certitude demonstrated by Radin's experiments over decades can't be dismissed and should no longer be ignored. Coupled with progress in so many other fields, from ufology and physics to genetics and neuroscience, it's becoming increasingly apparent that our notions of human existence and identity need a drastic reformulation, as do our most basic ontologies. When repeatedly confronted with what the rules say is impossible, it's time to change those rules. Dean Radin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I've read several of your books, and you're a gifted author. You're funny and you're cogent, and you present an argument that's hard to refute about the nature of these sorts of things. But let's first start with how you got into the subject of these sorts of things. I mean, someone coming out of university, they're going to have a list of options, and for most folks, going into like parapsychological research might not be a good thing for your career. But you chose bravely, and we're grateful for that. But how did you make that choice?
I'm happy to answer that, but I wonder if I could comment first on your opening bit.
Please.
So
Okay.
much of it I agree with, that science is typically presented as though we're just about to wrap everything up and now it's all finished. And of course, nothing is farther from the truth. The thing is, though, that reductive materialism as a doctrine or as a technique is not going to go away. It's way too successful. I think what will happen, though, as science continues pushing boundaries in all directions, that reductive materialism will be seen as a special case. It works really well for some things, and it doesn't work at all for other things. And so the things that it works well for are what we might consider as the physical world, the world that's outside of our mind somehow, out there. It works really well in capturing parts of that. Where it fails completely is what's happening on the inner world. And sometimes this is expressed as looking at physics from the outside versus looking at physics from the inside. So the outside world is more or less material. It looks less and less material the deeper you go, in a sense. Like quantum mechanics doesn't look physical at all, but nevertheless is considered part of the physical world. Whereas looking at physics from the inside is our experience and aspects of subjectivity and the mental world and so on. So I think what's going to happen, as I said, is that materialism is not going to go away. We're not going to have to throw away the textbooks. What we will have to do is revise the textbooks, as we do every 2 years anyway, and say that, oh, now we recognize that much of what we used to think of as encapsulating the entire reality is a piece of reality. And so this makes it much less scary. I mean, if you're an
Yeah.
academic and you're thinking your entire career is going to get thrown away, no wonder there's a lot of resistance to it. But if you simply say, well, look, all we're recognizing here is that, as we have seen throughout the entire history of science, is that you think you understand something and then eventually recognize, oh, we need to expand our understanding of what's going on here. What we used to think was fundamental is actually a special case, but now we understand better. That's all that's going to happen.
Sort of transcend and include rather than just completely do away with, right?
Exactly. Yes. Don't throw
Yeah.
away the old stuff that works. Just make it bigger. Understand it
Yeah.
in a different way.
Well, thanks for that
So,
clarification. I appreciate that.
yeah. So how did I get involved in this? When I was growing up, there was no Harry Potter, but they're the equivalent of fairy tales and science fiction and tales of the mystic masters of the East and all that sort of stuff. Uh, Perpetually fascinating then, as just as it is today, as we see reflected in our novels and TV shows and especially superhero movies. So who is not interested in that? Like, who has zero interest in it? And I would argue that a very, very small fraction of 1% really have no interest. And the easy way to demonstrate that is saying, well, how many billions of dollars does each new superhero movie make?
Yeah.
People are attracted to these things. They see it again and again. They love it.
Yeah.
So I was no different than that. Maybe the only difference is that at the same time that I was interested in those kinds of entertainment, I was also interested in science and technology, and I, at that point, had a musical career too. I was in a career track to become a classical violinist. So I was interested in lots and lots of things, and at some point, I discovered a book on parapsychology because I read a lot too. So once I found that book, it kind of pulled a lot of things together for me, because now I saw that there was a scientific way to study things that were considered spooky and interesting. And so I thought, well, I kind of like science and mathematics and technology and that way of understanding reality, because I was brought up with no religious background at all. I mean, it's not that we were atheist, it's that the topic actually was never even raised. Like, I knew there was this thing called religion, but we had no idea what were people doing out there. I don't know. It was just not part of what we discussed in our family. We did discuss a lot about philosophy and about literature and music and things of that sort. We were in the arts primarily. But I was attracted to science. So I saw, okay, here's a way to take science and apply it to areas that were considered controversial, but I didn't care. I mean, if you grow up in an artistic family, you're always pushing against the conventional. That's in many
Absolutely.
ways what art is. So it was all very natural to me to connect science with trying to understand what about Harry Potter or equivalent might actually be true. So that was the origin of it.
In your book, you talk a little bit about that, sort of inherent desire of folks to kind of explore that and be entertained by those notions. I remember myself as a kid, I read Lord of the Rings, and I remember, staring at objects across the room, being like, something's going to happen. I'm going to focus on this for days, and it's eventually going to shift. When it didn't, I was disappointed, and but that began a sort of a natural sense of my own curiosity in that. You've had a career of researching this stuff, and you mentioned in your various books the level of certitude that you've achieved with some of these experiments, where it's odds against chance are are astronomical in terms of they're actually occurring, although the effect is small. I mean, standing at this point, when you've been through all those experiments and all that work, how certain are you personally that there is something at play in terms of human consciousness and its ability to either get information or affect, the reality field? Yeah.
99.8%.
Okay.
And the reason why there's 0.2% left over is because it's part of the structure and aspiration of science to always doubt. Doubt everything all the time, because if you don't, you're likely to start making mistakes, because we have hundreds of biases, cognitive and perceptual biases. So part of the scientific process, then, which is one of the reasons I was attracted to it, was that there's a few things that will contribute to your idea of what reality is and how it works. The first one always is your own personal experience. So when I was growing up and in my family, nobody ever talked about psychic experience or mystical experience. We didn't have those things. I didn't have them. And so I didn't have that as the first thing that I could pay attention to. The second thing then is if you're a scientist, you learn not to pay too much attention to authority. What your initial reaction is, I need to see that for myself to make up my mind. But you can look at books and articles and people in authority who make claims and say, well, okay, well, that's intriguing. Maybe I should look into that. That's what I did then. So I had read books from J.B. Ryan and lots of other people, and they were reporting all kinds of interesting stuff. My inclination was to say that's intriguing enough to actually start doing experiments, because the only difference between an experiment and experience is the formality of it.
Yeah.
An experience is spontaneous. It's things that happen. And then if you deny it, you're basically nuts. You have to accept your own experience. Unless you don't, which happens also, but then that's a matter of what your unconscious gets in the way.
Yeah.
So a formal experiment is a way of attempting to get rid of many of the perceptual and cognitive biases that we're all subject to. That's why you use things like double-blind designs and protocols that get rid of things like sensory leakage and so on. So I started doing experiments even in high school and continued through college and graduate school, and even when I was working in conventional places like Bell Labs. And by continually doing that, either as a hobby or sometimes within the structure of where I was, I slowly began to gain confidence based on experience, but within the formality of an experiment. And one of the things I find often is that, we do an experiment, we get where chance would be 50%, we get like a 54% result, which the odds against chance of that could be a gazillion to one. But
Exactly.
people will say, well, you only got 4%. Like, who cares about 4%? This is a mistaking the magnitude of something, how big something is, with the confidence you can gain in that is a real thing. And so the example here is the charge on the electron is a number that starts with something like 18 zeros, 0.000000, and then a whole bunch of numbers after that in terms of coulombs, which is a measure of charge. Well, who cares? We care because once we learn more about what that was, the charge on the electron, the entire world now runs on hundreds of thousands of terawatts, which are all basically all the way devolved down into electrons. So if you have enough of these things, you can do all kinds of interesting stuff. That's why the magnitude of an effect, and by the way, in a laboratory, the magnitude of the effect is usually pretty small, because we're specifically getting rid of every possible other explanation. And in addition, the motivation that we can provide in the laboratory is usually pretty small. It's really hard to get people excited about looking at a graph on a screen and making it do something. Whereas in the real world, typically motivation is life or death or something in that domain, in which case you don't need to motivate people at all to make something happen.
Because it seems like it's a consciousness, a phenomenon of consciousness. So in a heightened state of consciousness, it seems much more likely and dramatic when things do happen. Correct? I mean, that seems to be what has been noticed by researchers.
Yeah, we all want the UFO landing on the White House lawn. I want that
Right?
too.
Yeah.
We want to see things move. We want to see things levitate and so on. We have to be clear that where are we drawing the line between embellishment and fiction versus what does the real world have? Well, anything in fiction, whether in movies or novels or whatever, it's always going to be more interesting than real life, because real life, usually, if you're lucky, that stuff is not happening. So from a scientific perspective, what becomes very, very interesting then is that some aspects of psychic phenomena, of magical phenomena, are actually real. It's not the embellished stuff that we see in fiction, but nevertheless is still real. Well, that, in a sense, changes everything. It doesn't change everything, so we need to throw the textbooks away. I'm going to add that again. It changes it, and then it says, oh, we have a more comprehensive understanding of what the world can allow. And that's what changes everything.
It's interesting when you I mean, talk about the results of your research, and then also you've done something where you've gone through and you looked at the history of the experimentation and done a meta-analysis, right? Where I mean, the odds against all of the results collectively together of it being chance or it being defective testing or diluted results or whatever is basically it's non-existent, right? So my question, I guess, is why can't people accept that? I mean, if people follow science and they believe in the rules of science, you're following those strictures and you're demonstrating something, but still, I mean, I would say the majority of mainstream scientists won't even consider the possibility that what you're revealing is true. Why?
I would say that actually the majority of scientists do accept these results,
Okay, okay.
but they can't talk about that in public. There's the taboo prevents what you can talk about in public. In private, it's a very different matter. And so one of the ways of seeing this is you run anonymous surveys among scientists and engineers at elite universities, where you figure that people are going to be the most conservative in terms of what they say. But if you ask them anonymously, and then we had a series of 25 different kinds of psychic experiences that could happen without using the sensitive terms, just describe as things like the feeling of being stared at, or hearing the phone ring and immediately knowing who it is without paying attention to the caller ID or the ringtone. Those are very common experiences. So we asked these 25 questions, and we mainly are targeting scientists and engineers at mostly research type universities, which are higher in some tier. And then we also surveyed the general population, and then we also surveyed the membership of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So those three categories from a distance, you would say, well, the members of the Institute of Noetic Sciences would be believers. They're enthusiasts about this stuff. So not surprisingly, over 99% said they had experienced at least one of these 25 kinds of experiences, and on average about 8 of the 25. And that included everything simple from a sense of intuition or gut feeling, all the way up to levitation. So like broad range of things.
Yeah.
So the general population, 94%. And we're on average 7 or 8 of these. What about the scientists and engineers? 94%. On average, 7 or 8 of the 25.
Wow.
Well, then what's happening here? But
Yeah.
why is it that we get the impression that most scientists and engineers would just dismiss this? The ones who do dismiss it publicly, loudly, are a pretty small minority. It's roughly maybe 4 or 5%. They get really pushed by this. They have an emotional response to it. They think it's all bullshit and they just simply want it to go away. So they'll be loud about it. All the other ones, which is the majority, are thinking, oh, that's kind of interesting because it kind of happened to me one time, but they learn very quickly you don't talk about it. To the extent that I would occasionally get a phone call or an email from somebody at a university and in hushed tones tell me of their interest and don't tell anybody else. And then shortly thereafter, I'd get another email or a phone call from someone at the same university in the same department expressing the same kind of interest. And so every so often I'll say, well, do you know so-and-so? And yeah, they're in the next office. Do you know they're interested in the same stuff? No, because they had never talked about it. And they're like in the same department, the same university, and even sometimes next door in their offices. And they just, you don't talk about it. So it is a classic taboo. It's not allowable in the academy. There are reasons for that. I mean, it goes back 500 years as to why this taboo has come about, but and I think it's beginning to crack.
Yeah, I mean, for practical reasons, a lot of it may have to do with funding and reputation, right? I mean, if there's the gatekeepers of who's paying for these experiments or their research, they hear that, and then maybe their esteem for that particular scientist might go down, and so that's what they're practically afraid of, right?
Yes, some of it is that. There's also fear about the one person on the tenure committee who decides, no, they don't like this. So there's two reasons that this comes about, and you can see this echoed down through the centuries. One is religious objections. So depending on the flavor of religion, some of them imagine that what we're talking about is demonic. That's what they've learned from catechism, and that's what they've been told. It's demonic, don't do it. That shapes how they view this kind of research. So if they hear something that appears to be contrary to what they wish the world is like, they'll attack it. They'll either be loud and attack it, or they'll just be on a committee somewhere and they'll say, no, we're not going to give that grant. Or it'll push somebody's credibility down a couple of notches. So that, and that happens. That is definitely around. The other side, though, is from scientists. Scientists who go through an entire scientific career usually don't hear anything about the philosophy or the sociology of science. So they have kind of, they may have very deep knowledge in their silo, but they're naive in terms of the way the science actually works. And they're particularly naive about the underlying assumptions within science because they never had a course on the philosophy of science. They don't realize that reductive materialism is one set of assumptions. And very often, even among physicists, they don't realize that the founders of quantum mechanics were all idealists. They all believed that consciousness was fundamental. Didn't stop them from coming up with really good physics, but it's a very, very different mindset. So if you're an idealist and somebody's telling you about things that the mind can do that might seem anomalous, they don't reject it. They were thinking internally, well, yeah, I mean, the mind is creating the physical world in the first place. So of course, there are all kinds of strange things could happen. But if you go through many generations of physicists who are forgetting to mention that they're actually it's sitting on a set of assumptions, and that the founders of quantum mechanics were very different than what we've turned into today, then you would initially say, oh, this person's doing an experiment showing that mind and matter interact. If they know anything about quantum mechanics, what should come to mind are things like the quantum measurement problem or the quantum observer effect. That's what should come to mind. Many people, even who do have that come to mind, immediately jump into, well, that's solved by decoherence, or that's solved by this or that. It has nothing to do with consciousness at all. You can trace that very interesting argument that physics has nothing to do with consciousness, full stop, all the way back to Galileo. So Galileo avoided being burnt at the stake because he separated science at that point. This is back in the 1600s. He said that science should only be involved in the objective world. Things that are measurable, that are external, and anything to do with the subjective world, we don't do, that's not part of science. And he did that as a strategic choice because at
he
the
was under
time,
duress.
well, at the time, the Catholic Church said that anything to do with the human spirit, which by they meant internal experience as well, that is the domain of the church. You shall not say anything about that. So Galileo knew that. The Council of Trent in the 1500s had actually created this idea that the church will take care of anything to do with the spirit and don't you dare touch it. And it allowed science to progress. Because if they didn't do that, then science would be very different today. I mean, it would have been suppressed in the same way that the things having to do with the mind are suppressed. So that is echoed down through the ages. And I would guess that many physicists today, many scientists today, don't realize that some of the prejudice is coming out of centuries of this kind of suppression and intentional split between mind and matter.
Which is so interesting when you consider that, I mean, position by Galileo was forced upon him in a way because of the church's authority. And so, I mean, in his own real thinking, I wonder where that division stood, if he actually thought that those two things should be kept separate. I mean, we think of Newton, and he was messing around with alchemy and things like that, so he wasn't a strict physicalist necessarily. But I'm not sure about Galileo.
He didn't make his interest public.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it was a.
So it's a very good question about Galileo. I don't know if there are like personal journals that he wrote where what he really believed.
Yeah.
I don't know that. Now I'm going to have to look it up. It's an interesting question.
It is. So, I mean, when we talk about these things, I immediately want to go back and say, well, what's the ontology that makes this possible, right? What is it about the nature of the universe and the human mind, how they're connected? I've done a lot of reading over the last couple of years about, the perennial philosophy, mysticism, those sorts of things. You mentioned in your book, Real Magic, you refer to what I think the term is psychophysical nature of reality. And I wonder if you could sort of break that down for us and give us a sense of what you mean by that in terms of how the universe operates.
Well, just keep in mind, all of these are best assumptions
Sure.
because we can only, our language is really not adequate to talk about these things very well, and our perceptions are very limited. But so what you see happening now is that for hundreds of years, materialism in one form or another has been sort of the received wisdom, unless you're very religious. And this is one of the reasons why there's a clash then between most fundamental religions and science. That's why there's a distrust that has occurred over time, which is unfortunate. But if you're within the sciences, uh, our technologies demonstrate to us that as an approach to understanding the physical world, it works really well. That's why we shouldn't get rid of it, can't get rid of it. But what about internal experience? And in particular, the idea that mind and matter interact not only in the body, it used to be laughable that that mind-body medicine was a thing. It would be dismissed as psychosomatic, or even before that, saying it's ridiculous. It doesn't matter what you think. It's not going to affect your body. We now know, yes, it definitely does through placebo effects and whatever. The question is, well, how far does that go? Does your internal intention also affect things outside of the body? So it's true, materialism, it's really difficult. The first thing that most people jump to is it's electromagnetic.
Yeah.
Well, no, and there's lots of ways we know that it's not an electromagnetic effect. It's not any of the known four forces. It's something else. So we have to jump into philosophy then to say, well, what other kind of models are there that can accommodate materialism but is bigger? Well, it's panpsychism and it's dual aspect monism and it's idealism and flavors thereof.
Yeah.
So idealism is that everything starts from consciousness and somehow the physical world evolves from that. It emerges somehow. The somehow at this point is pretty abstract. We can kind of go through that route from a mathematical perspective. We don't know how to do it in any greater detail than that. There are just speculations about how that would happen. This is why, as a working hypothesis, I like dual aspect monism. Another flavor that is also called neutral monism. This comes from Spinoza and philosophers like that. So dual aspect monism actually emerges to a large extent out of quantum mechanics. And it comes out of physicists who are thinking deeply about the nature of observation and measurement in the quantum world, because it's easy to demonstrate that what you know about a quanta changes its behavior. Well, there's nothing like that in the classical world, but that's what happens in the quantum world. So how does that happen? Well, if you ask somebody, and I've seen actually science spokespeople say, well, the reason why the double slit experiment shows that you can make something that's wave-like turn into particle-like by measuring it in a certain way, their description is the reason why that happens is because a photon, say, that you're measuring is so small that in order to measure it in any way, you have to interact with it. And so it's the interaction with a physical device that is causing its behavior to change. That's true, except that's not sufficient. And the reason is that there's a whole domain of measurements that are called interaction-free. And there's another domain called negative outcome or negative result measurements. And so the way of thinking of this is if you have a double slit system and you put a photodetector behind one of the slits, you will gain knowledge as the photons go by, and you try to arrange it in a way so that when you see a photon or an electron, that it doesn't interfere too much. You're not interacting much, but you have to interact some, otherwise you'd never detect it. So what do? You set up a system so that every time you shoot a single photon through a double slit, that if it hits the detector, you essentially get the equivalent of a click. So you get a click, and then you also get another click when it hits the screen. So you get 2 clicks each time. So if you fire the electron or the photon and you get click, click, you know that you understand where it went, and that would cause it to behave like a particle. Well, what if you fire it, you don't get a click, and you get a click? You just get 1 click. that means it had to go through the other slit because it didn't go through the other one. Well, that's interaction free. You
Yeah.
knew what happened, you had knowledge, but
Yeah.
it didn't interact with anything. It still looks like a particle. If you set the same kind of arrangement, which is important because now it means it's not an interaction effect.
Yes.
Yeah,
Somehow
so
it's your knowledge of whether it happened somehow is that bit of information is transmitted to the phenomenon somehow. I mean, it's
how does it
yes.
know, right?
Yeah,
Somehow your
exactly.
knowledge is interacting with the way that properties of a quanta behave.
Mhm.
So yeah, so how does that happen? And that this line of thinking and experimentation is kind of conveniently forgotten when people talk about this because it's much, much stranger than it is typically portrayed. But it opens the door. It opens the door more than a crack. It opens it actually quite a lot towards looking into some other realm that we don't have good descriptions of yet. But when you look through that doorway, you can see that somehow there's something about mind, information, consciousness, something in there which is making the physical world behave in one way versus another. So that's what von Neumann and Wigner and a whole bunch of other physicists were saying. There's something about consciousness that seems to make a difference. So in that sense, and people say, well, that's ridiculous because that would say that if you're not looking at the moon, it's not there. That's not completely right. The moon, whatever that means, its properties are not the same as when you're looking versus not, but there's probably something there. And it doesn't even involve humans, right? We don't know where the consciousness begins and ends. Well, maybe there's consciousness written into the fabric of reality, as in panpsychism, and so everything is being observed all the time. That's why there's a certain amount of stability out there. That's why it allows us to do physics at all, because something's watching all the time. The puzzle with panpsychism within us is that we may have trillions of bits of things, of subatomic particles, each of which has a little bit of consciousness, but we experience a unitary consciousness. Well, that's the binding problem. How do we get one thing out of the gazillion things?
Yeah.
Of course, you don't get just one if you have multiple personality disorder, then you could have a lot of things going on in there. But anyway, that's an unsolved problem. So dual aspect monism says you look through that doorway and you can see something about consciousness. The physical world is emerging out of it in some way. Carl Jung called it the unus mundus. It's the one world. It's something that is a psychophysical environment. It has the capacity to have psyche emerge from it, or to have the physical world emerge from it, or many, many other things too that we don't have names for. So in dual aspect monism, it is called that from that unus mundus, everything world, aspects can split out of it. So the two aspects that we're familiar with are mind and matter. But in the moment you have things emerging out of the same source, they're going to be correlated. They're going to be intimately correlated. So the metaphor, that's the easy way to talk about it, is two sides of the same coin. The coin is the unus mundus. The heads and the tails are mind and matter. They look very different from each other, but they're intimately correlated. That's why we see mind-matter interaction effects. So you can use that as a kind of a working hypothesis and come up with experiments. And to a large extent, that is the underlying idea within a lot of experiments involving the behavior of mind will affect the behavior of the physical world.
How do we get beyond? I mean, understanding that science always retains, like you said, that 0.2% short of certitude because you don't want to, lock your mind to any future possibilities. But how do we get to the place where it becomes demonstrably true that that is the nature of the universe? What kinds of evidence do we need, or how do we generate that kind of dramatic evidence?
Well, I think the evidence already is dramatic,
Okay.
but you need to be a statistician to appreciate it.
Yeah.
To answer your question then, in a larger sense, to get everybody on board, you need the UFO landing on the White House lawn.
Yeah.
That means in this domain, you need an application that people don't even need to know why it's working. They just know that it works.
Okay.
So how far are we away from thinking at your smartphone and having it wake up and do something for you? Well, when I use that as an example, what people have in mind today is something like Neuralink, a brain-computer interface.
Yeah.
That's going to happen long before we actually develop a purely mind-operated thing, not brain-operated, but mind-operated. And it's largely because there's so many unknowns when it comes to these mind-matter interactions that we could demonstrate that they exist, but we are very, very close to having no idea at all about how it exists. We know some of the factors that are involved in seeing it unfold, but that's about it. And so that's not satisfying, and you can't make technologies yet if you don't have that level of understanding.
That's a good point, though. I mean, what evidence are people today going to accept more than technology? I mean, once we can demonstrate understanding enough to build something with it, then people will be like, oh, well, it must be true because I can go
Yes.
to the Target and buy something and it's doing it, you know?
So here's a phone. You ask the average person, how does this actually work? Like
Yeah.
in detail, like build a new one. I know how a lot of it works, but I don't even know. I mean, I've worked in fields that are they're specifically involved in this stuff. I don't know how some of this stuff works, but yeah, it works. That's what it takes to convince somebody if they're not a statistician or not a scientist and want to dive deep into the actual data.
Now, one of the things I appreciated about your book, Real Magic, there was a book recommendation in there, which I really, really appreciated. Shinzen Young's The Science of Enlightenment, which I've read and loved it, thought it was fantastic. Um, and he talks a lot about meditation. You mentioned meditation in your book. What does meditation, from your perspective, have to do with these abilities and with consciousness more generally? How does that work as a kind of consciousness technology? Do you have any sense or any thoughts about that?
You can look at this, the answer from an Eastern or Western perspective. From an Eastern perspective, the underlying assumption is one of the perennial philosophy, essentially. It's that consciousness is everything. So the metaphor there then is an iceberg. Our conscious awareness, our everyday awareness is above the surface of the ocean, and it's a thing. It's a structure, and that's our everyday experience. But the rest of the iceberg, the much larger part of it, is under the surface. So is it possible then to dive below the surface and begin to gain knowledge about or to have a full first-person experience of what's going on below? So from a Western perspective, we would say that's your unconscious, your subconscious, your preconscious, or unconscious. With meditation experience, it is said that the longer you spend and the more practice you have in diving below the surface, the more conscious ability you have to experience it at that level. And in this metaphor, the physical world parallels this iceberg directly because it's all consciousness. So the more you dive down deeper and deeper into this metaphorical bottom part of the iceberg, the more you're diving down into the deep nature of reality, both the mental and the physical world. Because if you dive down far enough, there is no difference anymore between the mental and the physical. So from that perspective, if you can operate, you can maintain awareness and operate in the sense of putting an intentional spin on something at a very deep level, it will, by the time it bubbles up into everyday awareness, it could be extremely strong. Just like if you dive deep into the ocean, you put out a little bit of bubble of air, by the time it reaches the surface, it'll start expanding like crazy, and you'll have a gigantic effect. This is why if you would end up in being a very serious problem if you're very deep below the water and you don't expel air as you're going up because the air will expand. So that's from an Eastern perspective. From a Western perspective, it's more like the brain gets in the way, that the
Yeah.
ordinary, the default network of the way that the brain is sort of idling gets in the way of the ability to actually perceive what's really going on out there. So in that case, you can say, well, you look at the amount of information that's impinging on our senses at any given moment, billions and billions of bits of information. But every step along the way until it gets to your brain, it's getting stopped down. It's being averaged and preconditioned in various ways. But then it gets into your brain and is stopped down even further. So you have billions of bits of information that end up into this tiniest bit of trickle, like 100 bits per second. So it's stopped down by matters of billions by the time it comes to conscious awareness. And so you need to figure out, well, how do I increase it? Because maybe all of the things I want to know are already out there. It's like coming at me all the time, but I'm filtering all of it out. From an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense that that happens, because otherwise we'd be overwhelmed all the time. We couldn't operate.
It's like Donald Hoffman's idea. I mean, about
Yes.
our perceptions and yeah.
Yeah, we are shaped by evolution to pay very close attention to things that matter. And not only that, matter here and now.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter if the tiger's going to jump on us 3 weeks from now. What matters is the next 5 minutes or 2 minutes. So it makes sense that our whole nervous system has been shaped by evolution. The ones who survived are the ones who are not paying attention to what's happening on Pluto,
Yeah.
because that's not going to make any difference for us. So both Eastern and Western have a slightly different way of thinking about this, but in both cases, meditation allows you to become calmer and pay more attention. And I mean, we know from neuroscience that very deep meditators don't, well, let me put it this way. Let's say you do a simple experiment where you're looking at how the body and the brain react when you do a simple stimulus, like a sound of a clicking sound or a flash of light. An ordinary person in an ordinary state of awareness with no meditation practice will show a certain degree of response. It won't be a very big response, but it's there. Not only that, after a while, it'll go away, because they have learned, either unconsciously or consciously, that this click is not going to do anything. I don't care. They get bored from it, and the amount of stimulus response begins to decline after a while. That doesn't happen to a meditator. The meditator will respond, and they'll keep responding. Why? Because they've gone into a space where they're not blocking it anymore. And so by the same token, there's information out there from everywhere. I mean, imagine it as everything in space and time is there right now.
Yeah.
Well, if you get into a mental space through practice where you're not blocking it, you have the greater capability then of actually being able to see it. You use the flashlight metaphor of attention, where there's something over there that you want to pay attention to, and you can kind of feel that it's good. So you direct your attention to that thing, and now you can see it. Whereas if you don't even have that, that's not even part of your awareness because it's been blocked, then the flashlight's not going to help you, because the flashlight's kind of always pointing straight ahead of you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the people who follow the contemplative tradition, mystical, Eastern and Western, they've tended toward this idea of perennial philosophy, which is what you're advocating and sort of where we seem to be going in terms of our scientific understanding. I mean, it seems like they achieved that veridical information potentially through meditation, and were able to, glean facts about the nature of existence through this practice, this behavioral technology, which is fascinating to me.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so other civilizations and cultures developed other ways, like in the Greek mystery tradition, the mystery schools. That was largely based on psychedelics. Well, psychedelics will get you into similar places as meditation. It kind of forces you to go there, blasts you there. And some of it will probably end up being distorted depending on the nature of the psychedelic. But still, drumming and dancing and dreaming and psychedelics and meditation, many of these techniques that are designed to pull you out of everyday awareness, psychic ability will go up, almost all of them.
Question that I got into the subject through ufology, UFOs. I became obsessed with the topic, and I dived into it, and it led me to consciousness and all these questions that we are now talking about. What are your thoughts on non-human intelligences in terms of whether or not something ranges above us in, um, you know, uh, like the conscious reality, or below us, or I mean, the idea that there might be other entities in ways and in existences that maybe we don't understand, but still be there, are entities. You talk a little bit about it in the book, but if you could sort of give us a sense of what you think the possibilities are.
Well, if something like idealism is a more comprehensive way of thinking about the nature of reality, then there could be an infinite number of ways that consciousness can manifest itself. It could be a giant gas bag It could be the sun might have some degree of consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah.
It could be interstellar, who knows what's, I mean, no, there's an endless possibility of intelligences or consciousnesses out there in many different forms. So yeah, from that perspective, of course, there could be entities. We could, as people will say in certain kinds of psychedelics, we are saturated with them. We're permeated with intelligences of all kinds all the time. Some of them can interact with us. Other ones would not even be able to see us. We wouldn't be perceived by them at all, as we know, vice versa. In everyday state of awareness, most people don't see things like that. Some people do. They're called mediums. But for the rest of us, no, it's not part of our reality. Until you take the right kind of psychedelic like DMT, and then suddenly they're all here. Well, you can see why, from an ordinary psychological perspective, that would be disorienting. It would be disturbing to have to constantly kind of wade through all of these other things. And yet, you have traditions where people become possessed by such entities. The whole exorcism thing is out there, and there's a very, very long history of hauntings and whatever. So could there be ETs that would fit into that category that are here now? Sure. Maybe they're not ETs, they're earthbound things. I mean, the whole story is about fairies and the little people and all of that stuff. So yeah, this is, I guess, one of the reasons why then some people will say that stuff can't possibly be real.
Yeah.
It's not so much that they think that it's impossible as that it's very uncomfortable to think about it as being real. It's destabilizing. It makes you feel ungrounded then, because then you don't know what's true anymore. And you can end up becoming extremely paranoid about it, because now, I mean, this is the reason why even today in some countries, if you are accused of being a witch because you did something that made somebody else become ill or something like that. Well, the same thing would be true here, that you caused a servitor or an entity or something to attack you. Well, yeah, I mean, things happen. So sometimes you don't know the reason for it, and we start looking for reasons. And if you have these kinds of things in mind, well, you can dive down the rabbit hole pretty quickly and not be able to get back out again.
Yeah.
So one of the things in my latest book on magic, which I have given to the publisher, but now it's a long process to actually make it printed.
Yeah.
Part of the problem in all of this is, how do you not go barking mad? Which
Yeah.
is a phrase from one of the magicians who was writing about this. He could say, yeah, the entities are there. They're real, but put real in quotes because we don't really know the whole range of reality, what it could provide. But if you get into it too deeply, you can become ungrounded. And at that point, you go barking mad and you cannot come back.
About your new book, I mean, what would you say the overall, I don't want you to give too much away, but could you give us a sense of what the premise is? And then also, do you have a working title? I mean, people avidly follow your work, so I want to give them some breadcrumbs.
Well, so I have a working title. Whether it's going to end up with that is more up to the publisher than it is to me. The beginning of the title right now is simply the word magic. And the subtitle then is A Practical Guide for the Modern Mind.
Yeah.
And so this is, I do have aspects in it which are talking about the practicalities of magic, like what do you do?
Mhm.
But most of it is really a book about science and philosophy. It's
Yeah.
written in a way similar to real magic, where it's not going to scare you away because I don't use the word philosophy very much. It's written for the modern mind in the sense that anybody who's gone through a reasonably traditional scientific training, or even the educational process in the developed countries, will eventually get through the end of that, where they might privately think that they're very interested in these kinds of stories, but they don't know what to make of it. It's like not heads or tails because it doesn't seem to fit very well. This is especially so for scientists, because you either only hear bad stories about these things, like it's all fraud, so you can dismiss it, or you learn that you're interested in it, but you can't talk about it. So there's like a whole majority of people out there don't know what to do with these kinds of ideas. So that's who the book is written for. It's not written for somebody who doesn't care at all about the science underneath it. So in a sense, it's like rational magic. How do you begin knowing what we know through our education about the way the world works? How could that be true? But all this other stuff could be true at the same time. So that's why you need to look at worldview issues and philosophy and the scientific evidence at the same time. So it's similar to my first book, Real Magic. The big difference, though, is that I wrote that other book 5 years ago. So if only in 5 years, the direction that I was already talking about in my book, Real Magic, it is now underway very, very clearly. And what I mean by this is that if we're going to stay within the only allowable philosophy of materialism as a way of thinking about this stuff, we're never going to get there. That means we need to have science beginning to seriously reconsider panpsychism and idealism and so on. And the change that has happened now is that this is, if you're paying any attention at all to what's happening in consciousness studies and in the neurosciences and physics and a bunch of other places, as reflected in things like popular science magazines, Scientific American, New Scientist, and so on, every issue now has something about consciousness. And thought leaders and the physics and in neuroscience are beginning to say, well, we thought we understood what was going on, but we probably have to think about panpsychism. We need to think about idealism now. That's openly being discussed.
Yeah,
That is a major change. That's like a radical
absolutely.
change that people would never have guessed 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And that change is saying what I'm talking about here in terms of magic, it is making magic less magical. Like one of the phrases I've been thinking of, a way to express this is there's nothing magical about magic, right? It's just that science hasn't quite caught up to it yet, but we're getting there really, really fast.
Yeah, I mean, our knowledge level basically is the difference between science and magic, right? I mean, in terms of if we understand the mechanisms and we can, deploy it as a tool or as a technology, then it becomes science rather than just being superstition.
Yeah. And if you look in virtually any scientific domain, and even some of the scholarly domains, and you look at how often the word magic is used to describe something at the leading edge because they don't know what it is yet, it's everywhere. I had a whole chapter on this in the book until I realized, well, I don't think people would be interested in that after all. But in physics, in quantum physics, in astronomy, in biology, in medicine, many, many things are called magic. I mean, it's like there is a property now in quantum mechanics called magic. And the reason that term is used is because there's a combination of it's doing something much more efficiently or faster than we thought was possible. It's like magic. And so it gets labeled magic. So yeah, so it's like any other form. The magic we're talking about is something to do with the nature of consciousness. Eventually we'll have terms and explanations that will be more satisfactory, even though keeping in mind that we still don't exactly know why there's charge. Why does the electron have a charge? Why does it exist at all? If you think, well, what is an electron? An electron is a relationship between things. It may not actually be any electron. It's only the way that things fit together in certain ways. One of the ways that I like the description of, you say, if you have an electron all by itself in space, which is a complete void, there's nothing else around. Is it still an electron? The answer probably is no. It's not anything. It's not nothing, but it's also not anything in the sense of something that we have clear properties to, because nobody's looking at it. There's nothing to compare it with. So you start developing a relational model of how reality fits together. So what I just said is true, except if panpsychism is actually a thing, because there is then something looking at it. It's like the thing, whatever that is, has a certain form of internal self-awareness. The other way I like to think about where we are in science is that when I take my dog out for a walk, there are certain words and things that he will clearly respond to. But if I start telling him about things that I'm working on, which right now are about quantum optics, he'll look at me with the same kind of look as though I'm telling him about his favorite treat. The ears will pick up and say, oh, the treat, I know what that means. But then I'll say, well, I'm working with quantum optics, and, he'll pay a little bit more attention because he knows I'm talking to him. But what's he thinking about it? Well, it's like the way that we're thinking about it. Like I know treats, yes, and I know words like that, and it makes my ears pick up, but I don't really understand what's going on. I
Yeah.
don't think nobody knows, but we
Well, it's
we
like
do.
that's absolutely the truth. And I mean, like our language is limiting in talking about this stuff. We don't have the vocabulary to even begin to label part of what we're discovering or what we want to discover. Yeah, that's our time. I deeply appreciate you coming on the show. And I had other questions I wanted to ask you about Ken Wilber and uh, integral theory, which is something I've discovered recently, which I find really fascinating, but maybe another time.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And I can't wait to get your new book. Do you have an estimated release date or any
I
idea?
know at this point it'll be sometime next year because,
Okay.
they go to book fairs and they do whatever they do. So yeah, sometime next year.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the fascinating hour.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you.